Hey everybody, Ripley with Bob's Watches. Today we're talking all about vintage Omega and why the Speedmaster is widely considered to be the most collectible model from the brand's archives. Also, if you haven't done so already, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can stay up to date on our latest video content. A common trend that you may have noticed throughout the luxury watch industry is that it's often vintage models that are considered to be the most collectible and expensive. While there are always going to be exceptions to this, the fact that vintage watches are no longer in production means that there's a forever decreasing supply of them, and for highly desirable models, this typically means similarly high prices. When it comes to vintage Omega, you'll notice a similar story is true, and many of the most expensive Omega watches that have ever been sold have all been vintage references. However, not all vintage watches are worth a fortune, and this is especially true when it comes to Omega. On one hand, vintage models can often be some of the absolute most expensive options, with some selling for well over 6 figures and a few incredibly special examples exceeding $1 million. However, other vintage Omega watches make up some of the absolute least expensive options from the brand, and you can sometimes find certain vintage models for less than $1,000. Omega has one of the largest and most diverse back catalogs of any Swiss watch manufacturer, and this incredible diversity and the sheer number of different references available means that there exists an incredibly wide range of prices. This can make both buying and selling vintage Omega watches a slightly tricky process, and most general guidelines have their own list of caveats and exceptions. For example, a vintage Speedmaster dress watch is often one of the most affordable vintage Omega models available, but a vintage Speedmaster dive watch can easily be worth more than $10K. Similarly, vintage Omega dress watches are generally rather affordable, but one of the most expensive Omega watches ever sold was a vintage dress watch fitted with a prototype tourbillon, and that brought in more than $1.4 million at an auction in 2017. However, the Speedmaster is one particular vintage Omega that's almost always considered collectible, and even the most beat up and inauspicious examples are generally still worth a decent chunk of change. Founded way back in 1848, Omega is one of the few watch companies that could truly be considered a household name, and the brand is known for everything from being the watch of James Bond to the official timekeeper of the Olympic Games. However, mention the word Omega to any die-hard watch enthusiast and it'll likely be the Speedmaster that first comes to mind. Introduced in 1957, the Omega Speedmaster was originally developed for the world of automotive racing. However, its original purpose was soon eclipsed by its now famous associations with space travel. As the official flight-certified watch of NASA and the first watch worn on the moon, the Speedmaster is a true icon from the world of horology, and it boasts a history and list of accomplishments that few other timepieces can match. With that in mind, beyond its history of space exploration, the Speedmaster's refined yet functional design is a big part of its enduring success. The core aesthetic of the Speedmaster has remained largely unchanged for more than half a century, and while it's been in production throughout this entire time, not once has it ever looked outdated or out of place. The pedigree and general notoriety of the classic Speedmaster moonwatch helps guarantee that even the most inauspicious examples are worth at least several $1,000s. However, when it comes to vintage references, some of them have the potential to be worth tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. Generally speaking, the very oldest Speedmaster references are the most collectible and valuable, but probably the single most important factor when it comes to vintage Speedmasters is whether or not they have the caliber 321 movement. Omega was only producing the caliber 321 until approximately 1969, and it's estimated that there are less than 100,000 total examples of the movement that were produced during that time. Not only does this include all 6 different Speedmaster references that were produced between 1957 and 1969, but that number also accounts for the various other Omega chronograph watches that use the same caliber. However, more important than just its slim production numbers is the historical significance of Omega's caliber 321. All of the Speedmaster watches that were used during the early days of space exploration, from the very first Omega that went into orbit with astronaut Wally Schirra, to the model tested by NASA, to the ones worn on the surface of the moon, all of these watches were powered by the legendary caliber 321. With that said, an incredibly large range of values exists among vintage Speedmasters with caliber 321 movements. On the low end, you can sometimes find examples from the late 1960s for around $10K, while a well-preserved 1950s model can easily reach into the 6-figure territory. However, regardless of the specific reference, the history and legacy of the Omega Speedmaster guarantees that it's consistently one of the most collectible models, and if you happen to own an example powered by the caliber 321, then you have one of the most desirable and important vintage Omega watches in existence. Thanks for watching our video on why the Speedmaster is the most collectible vintage Omega. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can stay up to date on our latest video content.